Welcome to Communism 101. I am Dr. Elizabeth Spaulding, and I'm happy to be with you. I am a political science professor who draws on history and political theory in my teaching and research. I am also chairman of the board of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and Museum, which is an educational nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C. And please feel free to ask me questions in the Q&A at the end about not only the talk, but also about things about VOC, if you're interested. As its title conveys, Communism 101 is an introductory lecture. What are the basics of communism, including its ideology, history, and ongoing legacy? And why should we care? So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about approaches to government. Now, comparative terms can help us understand new or somewhat unfamiliar concepts. So let's start with what we probably know best, which is liberal democracy and capitalism. Then we will go to communism and then to socialism. So we are most familiar with democracy. Democracy is the form of government in which the people, the citizens, choose their leaders or their representatives by voting in elections. So you've seen voting go on. Voting is the mechanism by which citizens choose their representatives. And in a liberal or representative democracy, like the United States, each citizen is encouraged and expected to participate beyond voting. Liberal democracy is based on truths and rights. So you may recall in the Declaration of Independence, this is referred to as self-evident and unalienable rights. It's also based on consent of the governed, rule of law, and self-government. And in this form of government, power is vested in the people. So the representatives that are chosen by the people then govern according to the law. The people do not receive their rights from the government. Those they already have. Rather, those immutable rights, our immutable rights, are secured or guaranteed by the government in law. That brings us to capitalism. This is the economic practice that tends to go with democracy. It is a way of organizing the economy in which individuals and companies, rather than the government, own and make goods and services. So think about if you ever set up a lemonade stand, or if you babysit or mow lawns or have some other job like that. Capitalism is based on private ownership, free and fair competition, the free market, and private decisions about investments. Capital itself, the root of the word, is money and goods that are used to make more wealth. That brings us to communism. This is based on the abolition of private property. No private property. Communism is a system of government in which a single party controls the state-owned means of production and determines the allocation of goods and resources among the people. In the final stage of the theory of communism, the state is supposed to wither away. That's from Marx. That's a quote from Marx. And the government of persons is to be replaced by the administration of things. Now, in real-world communism, in almost 40 countries since 1917, this withering away has never happened. So at VOC, where I'm chairman of the board, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, here is a comprehensive definition that we've come up with a bunch of scholars. Communism is a system of centralized political power in which a single party dictatorship abolishes private property and controls the means of production and the distribution of goods and services. Under the pretense of a classless, egalitarian society, communist regimes in practice rely on force, use brutality, and repress speech, language, religion, assembly, all the other rights and freedoms that you think about when you're studying what we have in American government and our way of life. All of those are repressed. Karl Marx and other communists often interchanged the usage of communism and socialism. They also used these two terms to distinguish the two phases of progress leading toward full communism. So this has caused a lot of confusion about the possible meanings of both terms, of both communism and of socialism. Now, in today's world, socialism often describes something with a lot of government control, but not full communism. So socialism is a system of political economic organization in which major industries are owned and controlled by the government rather than by individuals and companies. Overall, private property and the distribution of income are subject to government control, which is often referred to as social or public. Of these key terms, democracy is the only one that is based on distinctions going back to the beginning of the discovery of politics. So you may recall from other classes that the discovery of politics goes back to ancient Greece. It's very old. Notably, Plato examined the rule of the many, few, and one. And then Aristotle described forms or regimes of government. And regarding democracy specifically, demos means people and krasi means rule or government. And we can see here a couple of slides of democracy in action. Capitalism, those are the economic practices that tend to go with democracy, is not actually about rule. It is what we call an ism. And in contrast to rule or government, an ism means practice or process, doctrine or state or condition. So unlike democracy, which means rule of the demos or the people, socialism is not rule of the social, and communism is not rule of the common. Rather, they are processes, doctrines, or conditions rooted in the extent to which the state, and that can mean the government, the central party, or both, owns, determines, and controls the means of production and the distribution of goods and services. And here are a couple of slides to show you communism in action. So that brings us to a very important concept called ideology. And from the beginning, communism goes very quickly from a theory to an ideology. In fact, it's an ideology in its essence. In 1848, German philosophers and friends, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, published the Communist Manifesto. This publication is arguably the most influential political pamphlet ever written. Marxist communism, or Marxism, as it typically has come to be called, posits the historical inevitability of class struggle. In each dialectical stage of that inevitable struggle, the most progressive class would win. In the essential defining revolutionary struggle between workers, and they were called the proletariat, which literally means without property, and capitalists, called the bourgeoisie, the working class would emerge victorious, and eventually society would be without classes, which is referred to as classless. And according to Marxism, that Marxist communism, Marxism, all this is inevitable. Also, according to Marxism, communists are the purest part of the working class. They would champion the common interests of the entire proletariat, independent of any nationality. And in the various stages of that class struggle, communists would always represent the movement as a whole. Communism thus calls for the emancipation, the liberation of all society from the old social order. And it's supposed to end exploitation and class struggles by abolishing private property and centralizing all production. And it's worth reading here one of the most famous passages of the Communist Manifesto. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. Marxism is often termed an economic theory, but as you can see here, that sells it way short. Marxism is really a comprehensive political, socioeconomic, cultural, radical ideology. That is, Marxism presents a fixed, single, unified worldview that has within it a plan of revolutionary action. And in this approach, Marx always joins state and society. So again, that notion of ideology, of radical ideology, the fixed, single, unified worldview that has within it a plan of revolutionary action. Marx and Engels drew on various German, French, and English and Scottish thinkers. And here, as introduction to what you might explore elsewhere, it is important to note that Marx was influenced by George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who was influenced by Immanuel Kant before him. But Marx then turned Hegel on his head, and rejecting what we associate as idealism with Hegel, instead, Marx grounded his own approach in the material, in the physical. He took the dialectical method, especially its inevitability, and crafted what is called historical materialism. For Marxism, there is then an inevitable direction or movement of human history. In the years after the Communist Manifesto, Marx shored up his argument for progressive historical inevitability with help from the English naturalist Charles Darwin. Marx and Engels formed a doctrine of scientific socialism, in which they asserted that a propertyless, egalitarian, classless society just had to happen. And this Marxist concept of social evolution is indebted to the Darwinian theory about natural selection. So great was Darwin's influence on Marx that Engels even highlighted it at his friend Marx's funeral. Now, if Marxism had remained on the page, that might be the end of the story, except for some scholars and their students. But Vladimir Lenin and other Bolsheviks embraced Marxism, especially its pseudoscientific theory of history, and focused on seizing political power through an elite group of disciplined professional revolutionaries. This is the famous vanguard of the working class. For Lenin, a propertyless and egalitarian society would emerge from the dictatorship of the proletariat that eliminated private property and heralded full communism. So, a radical political, socioeconomic, cultural ideology was joined with a revolutionary party at the head of a political movement that then unleashed communism on the world. This radical ideological party promoted and practiced violence, murder, terror, torture, false imprisonment, and disinformation from the start. Lenin consolidated his power in a civil war that he launched in Russia. His regime was responsible for the deaths of millions through execution, torture, imprisonment, forced relocation to, and forced labor in the Gulag, and famine, and all of this in less than 7 years. With help from his Bolshevik comrade in arms, Leon Trotsky, Lenin instituted a military, the Red Army, that was conjoined with the Communist Party and served the state rather than defending or protecting the people. This type of military became a hallmark of every communist state. Lenin also started the Cheka, the secret police. And by different names, the dreaded secret police became a hallmark of communist states everywhere. We're one slide ahead right now. Building on Marxism-Leninism, communist regimes committed horrible violence and terror again and again in dozens of countries around the world. This number does not include failed attempts. If Lenin, Trotsky, and their Red Army had not been stopped in the push after World War I, for example, communism would have spread into Western Europe a full 20 years before World War II. And as it is, the Bolsheviks had to settle in the early 1920s for Mongolia being their first Marxist communist victory outside Soviet Russia. In the lead up to the Second World War, it would take Joseph Stalin's pact with another tyrant, Adolf Hitler, for the Soviet communists to begin their acquisition of the Baltic states and parts of Eastern and Central Europe. Some other things to keep in mind here. Marxism purports to create a new man. That's from what they say, what they write. It says this new man will be better than and improved over the old man. We should always be wary of such promises. In the end, the Marxist new man is not a full person, neither better nor improved. And to the extent that he is made, it comes only after a universal behavioral conditioning process that the Communist Party and state impose on each person. Marxism posits that society would inevitably arrive at the end of the state, its withering away, along with the end of classes. It just has to get there. The ideology means that any and all means and tools are allowed and actually required to achieve the so-called pure end. Marxism establishes state control, and that's where it stayed and stays. And state control ends up being total, and that's what we get the word totalitarian from. So this is one of the reasons why we often hear reference to totalitarian communism or communist totalitarianism in the same breath. This ideology is against all the ways of society that we take for granted: the individual, the family, the community, the country. Instead, all of these must be repressed and remade in service of the Communist Party, not even in the image of the party, but in service to it. And because the Communist Party and its state are supreme, there is no room for transcendence. God would only get in the way. Now, maybe you have a strong personal faith, maybe you do not. You likely have friends of different religions, or some who might not be sure about the existence of God. But regardless, you are used to hearing in our liberal democracy about different religions, as well as people holding to no particular faith. But there is no religious liberty in and for communism. Some, though, try to argue that communism is just another way of carrying out radical Christianity. But as more than one scholar has pointed out, Jesus Christ urged his followers to give up their own possessions, while communists and socialists give away others' possessions. Further, Jesus Christ never required poverty. He said poverty and the all-important spirit of detachment from wealth would ease the way to salvation. And because it is built on this totalitarian arrogance, communism ends up making itself a god and imposes a false faith. And Marx referred to religion as the opium of the people and required its abolition because he said it was the illusory happiness of the people. His ism in practice, his ideology, though, has either severely repressed or outright abolished religion because it just can't be there. It gets in the way. Ironically, though, communism has become its own religion. So all of this together about ideology shows that in many and fundamental ways, communism imposes tyranny, and we can call this really a systemic tyranny. It's throughout. Now I'd like to move to a little history. We see this systemic communist tyranny and the struggle against it throughout the history of communism. I don't have time to do everything, so here are 10 dates that everyone should get to know regarding the history of communism. 1848, the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published their Manifesto of the Communist Party, creating the political socio-economic ideology of communism. Marx and Engels famously wrote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." And they stated, "The theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property." 1917, Russian Revolution. Vladimir Lenin and his fellow Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian provisional government in a coup in November 1917. They could not rule through legitimate means, and to consolidate power and impose the world's first communist state, they launched a lengthy, brutal civil war that ultimately established the one-party communist state of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, that's known as the USSR. 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Prior to the outbreak of World War II, the Soviet Union signed a secret non-aggression pact with Germany. Both nations promised that neither side would attack the other, as each eventually invaded and divided Poland in September 1939. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were also placed under Soviet control, along with Finland and Eastern Romania. In 1941, Hitler broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invaded the USSR. Although the Soviets and their Western allies eventually won the war, the Soviet Union lost as many as 10 million soldiers and well over 20 million people when civilians are included. Stalin also did all he could during World War II to shape the post-war map to the communist advantage. 1946, Stalin's Moscow speech and the communist division of Europe. Following World War II, Stalin delivered an election address in February 1946 that claimed both world wars were caused by capitalism and that the communists were the liberating, victorious force in each conflict. Before and after this ironically named election address, because there was no free election going on, Stalin broke his promises to his World War II allies and kept Soviet forces in occupied territories, including Germany, Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and the Baltic states. The Soviets forced each occupied nation to establish communist governments under ultimate control from Moscow. As former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously said in March 1946, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan soon followed in response to Soviet expansion and aggression. 1949, Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China. Following a destructive, multi-stage civil war that saw millions of Chinese perish in pursuit of communism, Mao Zedong gained control in China. The next year, Stalin and he would directly support communist North Korea in its invasion of and war against South Korea. The People's Republic of China also invaded and seized their peaceful neighbor, Tibet. At home, Mao established repressive policies in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution that caused as many as 70 million deaths, a victim death toll greater than both Hitler and Stalin. 1956, independence movements crushed by the Soviets. The Poznan riots were among the serious and, as it turned out, ongoing protests in Poland against the political repression and economic deprivations of the communist regime. As with other rebellions in Poland, the Poznan uprising was brutally repressed. In Hungary, marches and demonstrations in support of the Poles turned into outright armed battle against the Hungarian People's Republic and Soviet troops and tanks. The revolution lasted almost 2 weeks. More than 2,500 Hungarians were killed in bloody street fighting, and the Hungarian freedom fighter emerged as a global symbol of resistance to communism. 1968, the Prague Spring. When Czechoslovakia's communist reform leader, Alexander Dubček, briefly ended censorship and called for socialism with a human face, Czechs and Slovaks demonstrated widely in mass protests for their complete freedom. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev said "Niet." In the largest military operation in Europe since World War II, troops, tanks, and aircraft from the USSR and other Warsaw Pact countries invaded Czechoslovakia and crushed the rebellion. In further response to the Prague Spring, Brezhnev declared that the Soviets would intervene militarily if any other communist nation rejected the party line. As one writer vividly described this Brezhnev doctrine, "Workers of the world unite or I'll shoot." 1975, the killing fields of Cambodia, the Vietnam War ends, and the Helsinki Final Act. In the same year that Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge began its communist genocide that would kill approximately 25% of Cambodia's population in less than 4 years, South Vietnam fell to the communists. The fight to secure communism in Vietnam after the US withdrawal resulted in 65,000 Vietnamese civilians being killed directly by North Vietnamese forces. Under the new Socialist Republic of Vietnam, a system of harsh re-education camps was set up in which former South Vietnamese citizens endured deprivations, forced labor, starvation, torture, violence, and death at the hands of the communist regime. Meanwhile, a small bright spot in 1975 that grew in importance over time was the Helsinki Final Act between the West and the Soviet bloc, which made the Soviets acknowledge human rights and freedoms, including thought, conscience, and belief. Now, they still violated them, but it made them acknowledge that they existed. 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan and the Pope visits Poland. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to rescue and then control a struggling communist government began a 10-year wartime occupation that likely brought over 1 million civilian deaths. The Afghan Mujahideen, who were secretly supported by the United States, won the war, and the Soviets were forced to withdraw from the nation. The year 1979 also saw Pope John Paul II's first official visit to his homeland, Poland. He electrified millions of congregants at open-air masses with his clarion call, "Be not afraid." The Pope had long resisted both Nazism and communism in Poland. In 1980, he supported the establishment of Solidarity, the first independent trade union in a communist country. John Paul II became a significant international figure in the collapse of communism behind the Iron Curtain. And 1989, the Berlin Wall falls and communism collapses. The Berlin Wall, 96 miles long, cutting off the democratic West from the communist East with large concrete walls, barbed wire fences, and guard towers, was erected by the communists in August 1961. In January 1989, the East German communist leader Erich Honecker, who had helped to build the barrier decades before, said that the Berlin Wall will still exist in 50 and even in 100 years. He was wrong. A wave of pro-freedom independence movements swept the continent of Europe, ultimately leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the end of communism in the Eastern Bloc. Key movements took place in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. The Singing Revolution and the Baltic Way in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were also crucial. The Year of Miracles, that's 1989, continued and contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union at Christmas time in 1991. But 1989 was also the year of the Tiananmen Square massacre, in which thousands of Chinese were mowed down in June by People's Liberation Army troops and tanks. The fall of communism behind the Iron Curtain did not also bring its end behind the bamboo curtain. So the miracles of 1989 must be seen through the tears of the same year. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the costs of all of this. So many victims were created, and we need to go through the life and death tolls. The basic statistics are grim. Communist totalitarianism has killed more than 100 million people since the Bolshevik Revolution. This is way more than World War II. This is way, way more than World War I. It is still more than the deaths in both world wars combined. Yet we may find it difficult to grasp the enormity of this number. It may help to break this death toll down in other ways. Stalin, with more than 20 million deaths, was much more of a mass murderer than Hitler, with more than 10 million. Mao Zedong outdid Hitler, Stalin, and every other 20th century tyrant combined in terms of numbers. It may be as high as 70 million dead, perhaps even more, because we don't know the true, we don't have full information from archives, just under Mao. So as high as 70 million dead, just under Mao. Meanwhile, Pol Pot takes first place for murders as a percentage of population. Approximately 25% died in the killing fields of communist Cambodia. It must also be stressed that these tyrants committed this evil as part of the communist system, hence my emphasis on the systemic tyranny of communism. But still, it's all numbers, right? It happened long ago. It was before you were born. These things happened far away. What is also grim and must be stressed, however, is that these facts are not in the past. Marxism is alive and well. More than 1.5 billion people still live under communist regimes in the PRC, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. These communist states are antithetical to and repress human freedom and human flourishing. These regimes are also still responsible for the deaths of people each day. In addition to the death tolls, there are also life tolls and opportunity costs that must be included in any substantive analysis of communism's systemic tyranny and its creation of victims. Free speech, thought, and religion are all repressed. There is no rule of law. There is no consent of the governed. There is no free press. There is no right of assembly. If there are market elements, they operate with the permission of the state. The military owns and makes profits off businesses. There are deep, constant crackdowns on privacy and independence, which advances in technology, unfortunately, have only accelerated and increased. There are various forced labor and other camps for political prisoners, as well as re-education camps for so-called lesser violators. There is no real freedom. There are no opportunities for human flourishing. And I'm sorry to end on a down note, but I do want to leave us time for questions and answers, and I'd be happy to take those now from you, not only on what I've talked about here, but also if you're interested in hearing about our museum or a bit more about the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation.
Thank you, Dr. Spalding, for that great talk. And we hope that you all learned a bit more about the beginnings of communism and how it is still alive today, sadly. We do have a couple of questions coming in. First of all, did Marx really want violence in order to achieve his economic goals, or was this widespread death and destruction just a side effect of his ideas?
That's an excellent question. And Marx develops over time. So there are points at which he says, all of this is going to happen inevitably, and communism won't need help. But he says, in the Communist Manifesto that, of course, in order to move us along and get us especially from socialism to communism, but even to get rid of the, the bourgeoisie. So that means actually, while you have capitalism, you're going to need violence. And that I read, one of the quotes from the Communist Manifesto. And then some people say, well, wasn't that only in the Communist Manifesto? But in the couple of years after, Marx doubles down on the need for violence, force, and terror to make communism happen. And some of this is in the wake of the 1848 Commune, which isn't influenced by the Communist Manifesto. It's going on by itself in Paris. But there are some who are struggling for communism. And so Marx thinks, okay, great, that didn't work in the end, but now we need to really build on this and just get out there, and violence is okay, force is okay. And then you can find other quotes later on that he endorses the use of force and violence before his death. And then the anticipating what might be your follow-on question, he himself doesn't do that force, do that violence, but because he writes about it, when Lenin comes along, the Communist Manifesto isn't widely read initially. It takes until later 19th century, early 20th century. And so Lenin finds it and finds all of Marx's writings and immerses himself in the corpus of Marx. And so he picks up on this violence thing, as well as you've had some anarchists. Y'all, if you're in high school, you've probably studied a little bit about anarchists in some world history classes, but some of them become very important in the latter part of the 19th century. And so all of that kind of comes together when Lenin is leading the Bolsheviks, and they do their various attempts, which are eventually successful in 1917, to install the first communist regime.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And why did communism spread so far and wide? What did all of these communist leaders and dictators have in common? It spread from throughout Europe and Asia and Africa. How did it have such a hold, and how does it continue to have such a hold on the world as a whole?
Right. Another excellent question. I think it's a couple of reasons. Well, probably many, but a couple that we'll highlight here. The one is that communism, if you're just getting the filter of what it promises, it sounds good, especially if you're in a country that's very poor, that doesn't have the advantages. Marx thought you'd go through all of these stages of capitalism and then you would get to socialism, communism. But it turned out that communism could really do much better, sort of take down countries that hadn't gone through full industrialization. And so the promise of it, hey, you're going to have enough to eat, everybody's going to share, just on the face of it, some of that sounded good. And so people, they didn't vote for it because communism in all cases has been imposed. But they went along with some of the leaders of revolutions in particular countries. Those particular leaders, it's typically in most of the 40 countries where communism has taken hold over time, and there's still these 5 countries that are full communist countries today, as we said. There was usually either a leader or a small group of leaders who were very convinced and about Marxism, and then about Marxism-Leninism, as you get what Lenin adds on with the vanguard and the party doing so much more. Marx had the party, but Lenin fleshes that out. So anyway, these leaders, they are often educated abroad, and they sometimes in the Soviet Union or in intellectual circles like in Paris for some of them. And so they're educated abroad typically. They are immersed in the ideology. They buy into the ideology. Many of them in other countries all of them were supported by the Soviets in some way, and then often the Soviets and the Chinese communists as time went on. But the the Chinese, Mao wouldn't have succeeded without his help from the Soviet Union. So you get this support. All of these leaders then say, yep, I've really bought into the ideology and I'm going to impose the ideology. So then they get into power. They use force and terror to get into power. They cow the people. They repress them. They keep saying, we're going to bring you something better. But in the meantime, you don't have any freedoms. And then, as I said, all of these things that were characteristic of the Soviet Union are recreated in each and every communist country, including the secret police and some kind of labor camp system, which often results in death. And so that just keeps building. And then they have a tyrannical state, a totalitarian state, and they can last a long time with that. Now, there is resistance going on within in all communist countries. But it takes a different time and a different pattern of things in each country. In the case of Cambodia, where Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge kill, as I said, 2 million people, 25% of the population in less than 4 years, they are brought down not by the people, because so many of the people were starved at that point and dying, but they are brought down by another communist country, the Vietnamese, because the Vietnamese see that it's so bad in Cambodia and that they're getting too many refugees.
Wow, what a terrible prospect. And if students want to learn more about other aspects of communism, getting a little deeper into what we've covered today, where should they go, and how does the museum help to kind of facilitate that further education for students?
That's great. First, I'd like to invite everybody to the Victims of Communism Museum. It's in Washington, D.C. It's on McPherson Square, just a couple of blocks from the White House. And we, please look online for the hours and the days and all that good stuff. And if you're coming, especially as part of a school group, set up your visit in advance, and you can even ask for somebody from academic programs like Lily here to meet with you and to talk a little bit more, and to help you tour the museum. And in that museum, we are dedicated to presenting the history of all of the victims of communism. So that's for over 100 years, all around the world. So you get a great overview, and you get some in-depth, and you get the history of communism enough to understand why there are victims, right? So you can imagine that we want people to understand this issue, just like more and more people have come to understand the Holocaust issue. So it's kind of an analog that way. And so the museum has educational programs. If you're coming in person as part of a tour, you might want to ask to meet with a witness. That those are the people that we call that come to VOC or otherwise talk with our visitors. And they will talk about their experiences about living under and then escaping from a communist country. We have other educational programs and events, so I encourage you to look at the Victims of Communism website to learn more about those. Especially if you're a teacher, feel free to get in touch with our Director of Academic Programs and ask. And so that's the museum physically. We have online information. And also, if you're ever not sure about the sources you're looking at, VOC has a growing number of vetted sources, both people and materials. And we also have our Witness Project video series, and I recommend those to you. You can learn more through these mini documentaries about different countries under communism, and about these amazing stories of people who fought and struggled against communism and then are sharing their stories. And Lily, is there anything I'm missing? You probably have something else we should add.
No, I think that's great. And students should definitely check out our online curriculum for any school projects or research that they would like to do. And teachers should check out our online course, which we just released about a month ago, for better understanding for themselves on how to teach in their own classrooms. And I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Spalding, for your time today. And thank you to all who are listening. And our time is coming to a close. So have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Streamable Learning. Thank you, Lily.